So hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the first ever Global Adaptation Month pop-up discussion series hosted by EcoAdapt's National Adaptation Forum team. Global Adaptation Month is an initiative aimed at advancing action, awareness, and accountability for the field of climate adaptation. We encourage you to visit www.globaladaptationmonth.org to learn more and to consider sharing a commitment about an existing or upcoming project. I'm Molly Johnson, and I'm one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers and coordinator of Global Adaptation Month, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion, focused on sea level rise and when to retreat. So before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules. First of all, please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help us to reduce feedback. If you're using voice over IP option, please make sure your computer is on mute, even if you are listed as muted when you logged in. This whole discussion is intended to provide a space for conversation. Throughout the hour, you can use the chat box to share your thoughts or questions with the group. You can also message the organizers directly via the chat box if you have a question you'd like answered. During the group discussion period, we may call on audience members to share their thoughts. If we call on you, you can unmute yourself via the lower left-hand audio button. If you prefer not to speak out loud, you can continue to communicate via the chat box. Please also message the organizers to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We will help you address those to ensure you have a favorable experience. We will be recording and posting this session in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. And that can be found at www.cakex.org. We should have it posted within the next week. So I'm pleased to introduce today's facilitators. We have with us Debbie Love, who is a city planner for the city of North Miami. Prior to joining the city, Debbie served as a project manager for a wide variety of planning projects throughout Florida, including the Florida Keys. She believes in creating meaningful dialogues between constituents and their public servants, assuring that our most vulnerable and underserved citizens are included in any planning process, and reviving the art of community storytelling. Erin Deady is the owner, lawyer, and planner with Erin Deady Law. Ms. Deady's experience includes litigation, public finance, special purpose governmental representation, and creation and land use planning. Erin is a frequent lecturer and author on climate change, energy, environmental restoration, and public finance issues. So thanks for joining us today. And Debbie, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Everybody okay? Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you great.
Well, it's been an interesting, fantastic. It's been an interesting time. I know that we live in a very interesting time and lots of things happening in the world today. But we really wanted to talk a little bit about something that is creeping up on communities, and that is sea level rise and the sometimes uncomfortable conversation around retreat. So we're going to start with figuring out where you are, who's here, who do you represent. So Molly's created a survey that we would love for you to quickly take and so that we can see the background of and representation that we have with us today. So Molly, you want to talk about your survey?
Yes, thanks everyone. So if you want to participate, go to www.menti.com and use the code 889199 to enter your information of who you're representing today. And I'll share the results with everyone.
Let's take a couple of minutes to answer the questions so that we can get an idea of where you are, who you are. Wow, the result of government representation. You work for either a local, a state, a federal, or tribal government. Next is sort of a mix between the nonprofit organizations, conservation groups, I'm assuming, and others, as well as academic institutions. We do have some business and individual interests, so thank you for sharing that with us. You can go to the next slide. The effects of sea level rise are impactful in many ways throughout the country. Different communities, it's different issues, and some of the impacts are specific to coastal inundation and increased frequency of flooding in interior spaces, saltwater intrusion, contamination of land and ocean with pollutants, debris, and hazardous materials released by flooding. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the city of North Miami has been doing shortly. And of course, other consequences include displacement and decrease in property values and tax bases, and an increase in insurance costs, loss of services, and impaired infrastructure. The photos that you see on the screen are actually from the city of North Miami. These weren't taken during any major storm events. It was actually sunny day flooding where the water just, you can watch the water bubble up, literally come up out of the ground, and some minor storm events, but certainly nothing major. Go ahead. Next slide. So what you see here is, this is the graph that was NOAA used to form a lot of bases of the modeling that has been done in South Florida. This is the actual measurement in real-time data of sea levels. The closest station to the city of North Miami is in Miami Beach. And this actually shows a definitely rising trend between 1920 and to 2020. You'll just see it's projected on out. That's real-time data. Next slide. My apologies in the lag time. What you see here is the city actually analyzed old borings that were done from 1999 to today. And when you, as you all might know, when you do boring holes, it's really to figure out, not only the soil type, but where the water table is. So as part of another study that we had done, that I'll tell you about shortly, you can see that between, this actually shows the water depth to the depth to the water table from the ground. It's averaging where it used to be about 5 feet. It used to be 6.5 feet, is now 5 feet. So the water table has actually increased in the city of North Miami 1.5 feet between 1999 and today. This again is real-time data, easily be duplicated by other communities to look at that. Go ahead, next slide. Now, South Florida has been, we've been the beneficiaries of a lot of modeling, and one of my colleagues is going to talk to you a little bit about sea level rise modeling and what they do. But what you see here is the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. They adopted a 9 to 24 inch projection by 2060. And that's, of course, consistent with a lot of other predictions that have come through. And this this represents about a 0.4 inch increase annually in sea level rise. Next slide, please. So what we did, go ahead and when the next slide comes up. So what we did in the city of North Miami, we took one of the modeling tools that is available to us And using the Miami Beach gauge set that I showed you earlier as the basis for analysis, this is called the Sea Level Rise Viewer. It's a modeling tool that's really used for educational purposes. Really, you can't really use them for planning purposes because they're not distinct, but it is helpful in sharing data with both your public officials as well as your local community. Now, this is looking at a out to 2060, and you can see that large swaths of the city of North Miami, it's just in the boundary in red, is now flooded. On the coast, our coastal communities are completely inundated. Along the western portion of the city, you'll also see lots of flooding, and that happens to be where a lot of our low-income communities are situated. Go ahead and change the slide. So we want to pause here and ask you a question. So now that we know as a city, what will happen and by when, we asked ourselves the question, so how do we start the conversation for an adaptation plan? And specifically for the idea of retreat, because we know that that's usually the most controversial, and you'll hear a little bit more about that shortly from Erin. But in the city, we're actually looking to strategically maneuver ourselves for this very challenging conversation about our community's vulnerabilities and really what to do about them. We've apprised our city council about the flooding and future projections. We did that in the guise of another study that we had undertaken about septic systems and their vulnerability to sea level rise. So that really sparked that major conversation at the council level as we went through just presenting the data to them. It wasn't specifically, look, this is, sea level rise and, we need to, move out or whatever. It really was from one specific context, and that is the context of what's happening with our septic systems and the vulnerability to sea level rise. So other communities we know are probably either farther along in the process, as you'll hear from Erin today, or can be ready. So we asked you the question where you are. So where we can see is, can you read that for me, Molly, the results, please?
Yeah, sure. So the highest amount are people who are in the planning process. They've completed a study and they're creating the best plan to move forward. The second highest, which with 6 people, is assessment. They're studying and doing the research now. And then the next highest is implementation. They're currently implementing their plans. The lower number 3, they have not even started discussing it. And then finally, there's one person who's actually monitoring a project so far. So it looks like our highest amount is definitely people in the planning, which is great.
Which is absolutely excellent. So if you could go ahead and change the slide for me. I was really, am really excited that we got my friend and colleague Erin Deady to join us today for this very important conversation. Erin has, as Molly said, she's worked all over, has done this with a lot of communities. She's an expert in climate change, level rise. She's got her experience in Monroe County down in the Florida Keys. Erin.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So I'm going to talk about, okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the confluence policy issues, because it's another driver as to why local governments may want to start their planning process. Next slide. And so there are all different mechanisms with which climate and the law shows up, the Endangered Species Act, state claims, federal claims, cases about people that want climate adaptation to go forward, people that don't like the adaptation project that maybe a local government is implementing. And if anybody is really interested in a background related to these types of cases, Columbia Law School has a really interesting tracking database that breaks those types of cases down into different subject area at the federal or the state level. Next slide. And so it's not just lawsuits or regulatory programs. There are other places that the law of climate change shows up through national flood insurance reform. The risk rating 2.0 exercise may include a broader set of issues when we're looking at flood insurance rates. The community rating system program by FEMA is an incentive-based program where more and more local governments are starting to realize that they can get a dual benefit if they initiate sea level rise planning efforts in conjunction with participation or improvement of their class rating community rating system. The better you do in CRS, the more you receive discounts on flood insurance premiums within your community. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has civil works projects, sea level rise scenarios that they use, a low, medium, and high projection. The National Environmental Policy Act has new guidance in terms of how it looks at climate change and sea level rise and major federal actions. And the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, while that previous executive order was rescinded by the administration, community development, block grant, disaster recovery and mitigation dollars do require that projects be built to a higher flood resilience standard than just the 100-year storm event. So these ideas that federal funds or federal programs are requiring a higher level of resiliency is something that really gets to the heart over multiple contexts. Next slide, please. And so talk a little bit about a couple of legal concepts that are starting to make local governments wake up and understand what it means to maintain their infrastructure in the face of future sea level rise and flood risk that not be anything that they can necessarily control. And what does that mean in terms of maintaining level of service for roads or stormwater design? Please. And so I'm going to talk about two different types of concepts. And normally when I make this presentation, I have a little more time and I kind of go into very specific case examples, but I'm not really going to do that. One about the concept of torts, where there's duty breach, causation and injury to a party. And typically where we see tort cases come up is when there's a nuisance claim or a negligence claim. And nuisance in the planning world, we typically think of the person that has a bunch of stuff in their front yard that the local government may not like and it's causing a nuisance. Well, water itself can be a nuisance in a flooding case. People may not want water on their property for failure to operate or failure to maintain infrastructure in a certain type of way. So water itself can be a nuisance. There are cases related to these nuisance claims. The picture that I showed of an island on the previous slide is an island off of Alaska, Kivalina. They sued the oil industry for a nuisance claim, damages to relocate the island, which touches upon kind of the retreat concept. Takings cases are essentially the theory where private property cannot be taken by government for public use without just compensation. And typically what happens is a property owner feels that they've been aggrieved by a government action, so they will sue to get that compensation based on a public action. And we see takings cases related to flooding from infrastructure operations. In Texas right now, there's a series of cases against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for failure to operate dams appropriately, or in their eyes appropriately, during Hurricane Harvey. There are other cases. There's a case in New Jersey about a dune restoration project and whether or not that impacted an adjacent property owner's view. Interestingly, although it was going to give that person more protection with their property overall, they felt that the dune restoration project was going to impact the value of their property. So they sued the borough that was implementing that project. So this is important because if you're not taking action, or you're taking a certain type of action as a local government, you kind of have to be aware of property owners out there that want the government to do something, or they don't necessarily like the way the local government may be adapting or maintaining its infrastructure overall. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 examples, and at the federal level, the law is pretty clear. It does require government to actually take some kind of action to be liable in a takings concept. And so here's an example. Property owners sue the government for taking of the property for failure to maintain a federal road or a pump or and those property owners are inundated by flooding, some type of tidal flooding or water that is controlled by that water management structure. Will those property owners be successful under a theory that the operation of that infrastructure impacted their property value such that they should get compensation? And the answer is no, because in that specific instance, the government didn't do something with the operation of that infrastructure to impact those property owners. And so let's take that example and look at a negligence theory. Property owners sue the government saying that the federal agency failed to elevate a road or install a drainage structure that's impacted, then those property owners are impacted by tidal flooding. They're not likely successful under that theory because the decision to elevate and install those structures is a planning level decision, and the government is immune under a theory of sovereign immunity. And so kind of hold on to those concepts because we're going to illustrate how those really play out. Next slide. And so what is immunity? Sovereign immunity is the theory that government liability can be waived for certain types of decisions. And usually that's a function of state statute that says the government can't be sued for certain types of tort injuries. And I'm going to give some examples of how these concepts all kind of relate. Is a local government required to upgrade infrastructure? This is a really interesting question in the concept with the concept of adaptation. And a government is their decision to upgrade or improve infrastructure is their decision. It's a planning level function, and there can be no negligence or tort liability for that decision about whether or not to upgrade infrastructure. And there's a long theory of case law. Now, this is a Florida example, but it's pretty common in most states. Does the local government get to decide the level of maintenance? Traditionally, a county is not obligated, and it can't be expected or compelled to perform any type of project or level of maintenance except when it voluntarily assumes to do that. Counties get to dictate the level of maintenance that they undertake on their infrastructure. Next slide. Okay, so what are some examples of planning versus operations where a local government may find themselves on the wrong side of a lawsuit when it comes to adaptation? And again, this is really important when you're going about, doing this type of planning. So there's an intersection. A government decides with that intersection whether it wants to control traffic through a stoplight, through a stop sign, or some other like yellow flashing light or some other means. The decision as to what type of strategy it's going to implement to control the traffic at that intersection is completely a planning decision, and no liability will attach to that. It decides to put in a red, yellow, green stoplight. Well, once that stoplight is in, the government has a duty to maintain that infrastructure. And you could put in, you know, a drainage pump and insert that in our scenario here. But let's say lightning strikes that stop signal, and the government sits there for a month and does not maintain or get that thing back operational again, and somebody gets in an accident at that intersection. Well, the government would be liable for that, because it's then operating that infrastructure, and that operation is something that government can have liability for. The government is not liable for the planning decision about whether or not to put it in, but the government is immune about that decision about whether or not to put in that stop signal, but not immune from its obligation to maintain and operate that. And so are planning level decisions reviewable by courts? And generally the answer to that is no. Whether or not to build or change a road, that is something that is a level function to which government liability does not attach. Okay, next slide. And so in our scenarios that we talked about before at the federal level, let's talk about a scenario that's kind of near and dear to some of our hearts, whether or not a local government is liable for elevating a road and putting in more drainage to deal with tidal inundation and sea level rise. Under our example scenario 1, there's case law within the state of Florida that basically says, you know, the failure to maintain can be a problem for local governments. Once you build it, you've got to maintain it. You do have some level of discretion about how you maintain it, but the end of the, you know, scenario there is you absolutely have to maintain it. Under scenario 2 on this slide, property owners sue the government under a negligence theory and say that failure to elevate the road because it is flooding with drainage has impacted them on some way. Not their property value, but has impacted them and injured them in some way. And typically, a local government is required to act, and that there is some level of discretion, but not when it comes to a level of maintenance. If you build it, you own it, you've got to maintain it. Next slide, please. And so here's my hit list in terms of managing infrastructure and why you may, as a local government, may want to start planning for adaptation and the maintenance of your infrastructure. Make planning decisions and operational decisions about your infrastructure. Decide what you're going to build and what level of service you're going to achieve, and put that in terms of design criteria in your code of ordinances. Be transparent about it. And that gets into bullet number 2. You don't have to do it with a court is not going to compel a local government to maintain a road at any specific level, but you do have to maintain it. You can't just stop budgeting and paying to maintain your infrastructure. That is definitely not a good idea. And don't that you're going to terminate maintenance of your infrastructure without some kind of formal proceeding. In the case of roads, you would want to go through a formal abandonment proceeding before you can legally get rid of that obligation to maintain at least what you have. Develop policy solutions, fill in legal, make sure that you're transparent about your decisions. Next slide. Other strategies that you can use, codifying things in ordinances. There are ways that local governments have been developing design criteria that accounts for sea level rise and how you build and maintain infrastructure. Look at public interest factors in the evaluation of criteria when it comes to design of roads. And in Florida, we actually have requirements now that local government comprehensive plans do address sea level rise. You can look at real estate related disclosures that could inform property owners more explicitly about flood risk. Next slide. And so now I'm going to talk about Monroe County. They've been at their planning efforts for many years in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, integration with their comprehensive plan, integration with FEMA's community rating system program, and now they have embarked on a countywide roads and stormwater analysis to look at adaptation priorities. Next slide. And the county has also received some grant funds from NOAA, and one of the biggest work products that they have achieved is a watershed management plan under the Community Rating System program that looks at the NOAA Intermediate High 2100 condition, and this is part of the county's strategy to go from a 5 to a 4 in the Community Rating System program, which will translate into about $1 million worth of reductions of flood insurance premiums within the community. Next slide. They are in receipt of state level grant dollars right now, where they're doing more work to integrate climate change into their comprehensive plan through comprehensive plan amendments, and they are doing internal and external public engagement on this right now. Next slide. They have undertaken a pilot roads analysis to look at what it's going to mean in a couple of key locations to elevate roads. What kind of stormwater management systems are they going to need? They have uneven roads due to the settling of the muck underneath of the roads. How do you pair up the driveway access? What type of water quality do you put in place? And the county is at 90% design within these pilot projects right now. Next slide. They have achieved better elevation data. They secured mobile LIDAR data to make sure that their planning decisions are based on the best available elevation data. Next slide. And right now they have embarked on a countywide roads and stormwater planning process to develop a long-term capital plan to figure out what roads they're going to elevate and when, and what stormwater management systems will be in place, or in certain instances they may just continue to maintain the road as is because it just doesn't fiscally make sense to potentially elevate in that particular location. Next slide. So this is kind of the scope of work right now. By June, the county will make the first presentation on what one alternative design is in a particular community. But the idea is overall, we'll be looking at levels of service and alternative costs in the long term, a 20-year road paving program to put in drainage and elevate roads across the entire county, which owns and maintains over 300 miles of roads. Next slide. This is the timeline, and what we have found is we've needed to start advancing some of the policy and legal deliverables because the certain areas within the county keep getting hit very significantly with king tide flooding, and certain property owners are really demanding actions rather than so being significantly expedited. Next slide. And one thing that we're starting to realize is that when you're dealing with a county over 100 miles long and it's a chain of islands, you're not going to be able to provide the same level of service for drainage and how dry the roads are 365 days a year. Future growth is limited in the Keys, but where that growth is going to go is going to turn into or translate into a demand for services. So the county wants to make sure that they're cognizant about where that future growth is going to head. And there may be just neighborhoods where the county doesn't continue to maintain the roads or abandons the roads and lets private property owners take over that obligation through a formal abandonment process, or may need to be through some type of marine transportation, and the county is considering alternative modes of transportation. Next slide. And so I'm winding up here, I'm pretty close to the end. And so the county has a separate element of its comprehensive plan to deal with energy and climate issues and is in the process of updating that right now. They are updating their comprehensive plan to deal with new requirements in state law from 2015 to address sea level rise. And that translates into other elements of the comprehensive plan, like the capital improvements element or the land use or the housing element that dictate how you build and opportunities to build more resiliently and also to where potentially the county has committed to maintaining certain levels of service that may not be possible anymore. Next slide. And so these are the big picture issues that the county is going to be dealing with in the next couple of years. Looking at the output of this countywide roads and capital planning process and how that integrates with priority areas for stormwater. The county is in the process of looking at establishing adaptation priorities through adaptation action areas, is completing a shoreline assessment. The county is still recovering significantly from Hurricane Irma and is trying to relate disaster recovery policy and funding with future flood risk and resiliency, which provides both a challenge and opportunity at the same time. Making sure that their land acquisition makes sense and their land acquisition priorities make sense, as well as their recreation and open space commitments, and if those are going to be able to be maintained in the future. Next slide. Funding strategies. There's no one silver bullet for funding strategies. Local governments may be looking at taxes, special assessments, bonding programs, tax increment financing can be applied in redevelopment areas, creating stormwater utility, user fees, and there's a myriad of various grants. And again, mentioning that disaster recovery or pre-disaster mitigation grants are potentially a good tool to deal with resiliency issues as well. And I think this next one is the last slide. And so I like to end on a happy note with my presentation. So hopefully you've gotten something out of this. There's my contact information if you would like to email me any questions that we can't get to today.
Wow, Erin, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was just a great meaty bite for those of you who are in the process of the planning piece. But I think Erin's provided you with a great case study for you to take a look at and see what is happening in your community and maybe what you can take from what Erin and her team are doing down in the Florida Keys. What I'd like to do next is have a little bit of a group discussion. This will allow Erin and some other experts to take a look at what's, some of your challenges, some of your questions that you might have. And so, Molly, would you go ahead and jump in here on that? Because what I'm going to do next is introduce two experts that you haven't met yet. So Molly, you want to step in before I do that?
Sure. So I think prior to that, we're just going to encourage the group to share in the chat box if you're having these conversations in your own communities on sea level rise, and then what steps are you taking, what's held you back, and what best approaches have you found have helped out in the process. So go ahead and take some time to enter that into the chat box, and so everyone can kind of see where the group is at.
We'll just take a couple of minutes. We want to see what you have been doing. Some of you have been planning. So what did you find was your first step versus perhaps what Erin and her team did? Maybe you had a different thing. Why aren't you doing it? What's holding you back? Is it political will? Is it lack of data? And what did you find to be the best approach? We'll take a couple of minutes and let you answer. And while you're doing that, can you go to the next slide for me? My next slide. There we go. All right. So in addition to Erin, we've received a lot of really good questions from your registrations. Lots of really interesting questions. So we've selected two to be posed to two very qualified experts in their field. The first question is for my dear friend, Ka Lehu. Ka is the principal of Lehu Partners, and that he is an award-winning, internationally known architect and urbanist. He's out of Orlando, Florida. I worked with him and truly, truly appreciate how he and his team see things differently in the design process and how they're interconnected. And I love his term that he uses, a living system. And they talk about being very holistic in their design approach and making sure, and I love this term, to ensure the right of humanity and nature to coexist in mutual support and sustainability. Ka, can you hear me?
Hello, Debbie, I hear you well. Hello, everyone.
Fantastic. Ka, the question that we have is actually up on the screen, and it says, how can inland cities prepare for an influx of climate migrants retreating from the coast and ensure vulnerable, low-income, marginalized groups are at last to be helped and have their community preserved? Can you give us your perspective on that?
Okay. First, I need to a little bit of clarification. When you're referring to the marginalized community to be helped in their community and their community preserved, are you referencing the existing community in the inland county, in the inland city, or are you referencing the one that needs to be migrated?
I believe that it's from my understanding of the question, it is those for whom they will be migrating to, and then the people that are there that are vulnerable, that usually get the climate gentrification issue. You know, we've discussed that in many times about climate gentrification, and I think that's what this is referring to. Okay.
Yeah, so it would involve both group, either the group in highland and no group, you know, would be in lowland, right? The marginalized low income. Yes, I try to look at this phenomenon of that we're going through evolutionary lens. I think that the influx of climate migrant will be gradual, and believe we can better plan for it through publication, you know, by a program like this, and the dissemination of scientific material, coupled with sensible local policies. And this would require heavy public education and explain about the phenomenon of us versus them and the zero-sum kind of game mentality. This, and again, I shouldn't get kind of political, but I think this would require voting the right leaders and putting the right expertise in place. Because in time of crisis, and I think this is a crisis, just like the pandemic that we are undergoing right now. There's a saying, in time of crisis, where there's no vision, people will perish. So, and this thing, I saw a map of Florida for resiliency, and you see many inland cities right now on a higher land, but in terms of the infrastructure vis-a-vis their population is so underpopulated. So I think cities such as, you know, DeLand, Sebring, Winter Haven, Maldora, Lake Wales, etc., I think would be a good candidate to absorb that migration. And this is going to be gradual, I am sure. And it's already happening based on my you know, visual observation. Because downtown, those cities, they have infrastructure, they have street, but in terms of population, downtown population is very, very sparse, you know. So, and interestingly enough, that the map that I saw showing the migration direction to go to the inland city, it resembled another ancient map of the Florida Peninsula, which is dated, you know, even after the last ice age, which is the ancient Atlantic ridge stretching from Daytona to Lake Wales. So I think it happened before. So right now, you know, we just have to plan for it, and by planning, and again, many of the topics that were touched earlier by previous speaker that have to do with, you know, policies and plannings and things like that. So, and I just, it would be gradual, so we have time to plan for it. And by the way,
what do you think I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, but by the way, right now, you know, I'm working remotely. Many of us staying at home. This current pandemic will be a turning point because it's exposed so many screw-ups of the underbelly of our system, in terms of, you know, healthcare, in terms of social safety nets, in terms of disproportional inequality. And it's really a time of reckoning and moving forward after this, and how we treat nature and one another. And I think there could be a time to for cleanup and reimagine and repurpose our community in the way that it makes sense with nature, and this way that it makes sense with the limitation of human existence in the bigger picture. So I think in the way it happened like that, it's just a chance for us to experience the dislocation, the interruption, but also it is a chance for us to really question the existing practice, ritual that doesn't make any sense, you know. So it's worrisome, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to be creative and seize the moment and really intentional, create new possibility and build the future that we want. So.
Tom, let me ask you a question. One of the projects that we worked on, one of the biggest fears was displacement and gentrification of the existing Haitian community. I'm going to just, it was a Haitian community.
Right.
And I think one of the things that you talked about a lot was how to allow that quote unquote gentrification, but yet preserve the context and the cultural aspects of that community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that's important, but it would require investment, financial and cultural investment, and that's also tied into, you know, voting in the right leader, you know, to have bold vision. For example, in North Miami, you know, the way that development work is that growth has happened kind of hotspots kind of way. And for example, they, you know, filled in lowland area to build streets and to build houses, and now sea level rising, and they experience flooding, chronic flooding. And how can you relocate people into a higher land, but at the same time, you know, how do you compensate for the loss of property, and how do you you know, kind of sensibly relocate and also convince people to move with a coherent urban planning vision. For example, the low area that just sewage backup, drainage, flood, kind of most day out of the week, it become uninhabitable. So that will require neighborhood by neighborhood, even house by house, to relocate, and some kind of exchange program with the city to allow people to move up inland, and then the low area become a public domain for park, for wetland, for things that would allow nature to function in the way that in a way that it's kind of it makes sense for water flow, and water flow is will seek to equalize itself, and it goes to the low point. So as sea level rise, and how do you design the community in a way that those kind of space that can be flexible enough to absorb the water cycle, just like a sponge. I mean, and that would allow for wetland, for water park, and also for those some certain for water treatment action, for biological action. So to me in my kind of limited role as architect and urbanist, I can only speak from a technical and biological perspective, but then the decision at higher up from the political leadership of the community could be more challenging, and it's out of my control.
Well, thank you, Ka.
Thanks,
I think
Ka.
that my takeaway from that is the simple matter of planning. We have time for it. We need to do it. It needs to be on a neighborhood level. And if you look at what Erin was saying, it's really different in different areas, for even within the same community or within the same county. So thanks for sharing your perspective with us, Colin. That was really, really interesting. The second question that we have is for my esteemed colleague, Janetha Biscara. Dr. Obey is the director of the Sea Level Rise Solution Center at Florida International University here in North Miami. Dr. Obey, you're just my go-to guy on sea level rise, and I so appreciate you being here today. One of the questions that we would like to pose for you to tackle is, what is your process for determining, updating sea level rise scenarios to lead to decision making? In other words, who does it? How do you do it? How often do you do it? Et cetera, things like that. So really want to get your take on this, since this is what you guys do there.
Yep, yeah, that is true. Thank you, Debbie. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That's a great question. I want to thank Debbie and Molly for inviting me to participate in this. This question is interesting because I've been involved in the regional sea level rise projections for about 10 years or more, and I will explain how and how often we did that. And I was also involved at the national level for Department of Defense, and also NOAA and National Climate Assessment. So one of the things, who is doing it? Fortunately in our region, and this is probably a lesson for our colleagues from other places in the country, we have a wonderful entity called Southeast Climate Compact, or 4-county agreement to work together. And one of their first probably task is to assemble a group of sort of like an ad hoc work group consisting of scientists, government officials, professionals who are familiar with this topic to the scenarios for the region. And that's a very important aspect because you don't want to have one set of scenarios for, let's say, city of Miami or North Miami and one set for Miami Beach, for example. You want to have what we call unified sea level rise projection. So that committee process was very effective. It was tough, when you get a bunch of scientists together, they argue a lot, but we actually come together to come up with a set of projections that all the communities, both local and regional governments, are using. And so that has been a very effective process. How we do that? Early on, it was somewhat simplistic. We actually looked through all the literature around the world and regionally. We go to the federal government sources. Early on, it was simplistic, but lately, and the last time we produced is actually from in 2019. We improved the projections because we have better and better science. Every day you get a paper on sea level rise projection. And the news is that they're not going to go down. They always go up because we have a warming happening around and ice sheet melting, thermal expansions in the ocean and regional effects like Gulf Stream effect and gravitational effect. So the good news is that we have at the national level information for regional application, basically NOAA 2017. So we actually improve the projections as we go along by looking at, fairly well-respected sources. And we tend to use those published by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this time we use the NOAA 2017 report. And those of you who are trying to develop these, there's data for all around the country to do that. Now, how often we do that? The first one was published in 2011. And what we try to do is, and typically every 4 to 5 years, and that is to kind of see what new science we have. And if there is an IPCC report that comes out with sea level rise projections, and we want to revisit the regional projections by looking at those. So typically every 4 years, we had the first one in 2011, the second one in 2015, and the most recent one in 2019, which just was published. I think the earlier graphic you showed, Debbie, I think is the previous one. Along with that, we also write a guidance document because I think this is a very tough subject because there are a lot of uncertainties in projections. You see different scenarios. How do you pick the particular scenarios for your project? We try to provide some guidance, and typically for the near term, we can say, if the replacement cost of a project is not very high, perhaps you can afford to be using a low curve. And if you're going to a project with a longer lifetime, like a nuclear power plant or wastewater treatment plant, maybe more than 50 years of design life, you might want to use a high curve. At that point, it becomes a decision on risk, based on risk and what the community is willing to invest. So I think that's an interesting decision-making issue. So we try to provide, guidance on how to use those curves. And one final point, I personally like this idea of dynamic adaptive pathways. So, because there are a lot of uncertainty in the future projections, and you don't want to invest billions and billions of dollars up front because you don't know when certain sea level rise, like 5 feet or 6 feet, which is very important for a place like Florida. You don't want to decide on a big investment right up front. So we promote, jointly working with our colleagues in the Netherlands, this concept called dynamically adaptive policy pathways. And it's a very interesting concept to look at tipping points. And basically, you want to make a decision for the near term, but you don't want to preempt yourself from making a decision later. In other words, you don't want the developers to come in and take land that you might need. So that's sort of the balancing action you need to think about. and particularly in deciding on the retreat, and which we can talk about later if you like. But anyway, I think that's enough for now. Don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but.
Thank you, Dr. Obey. That was really important, because I think some folks aren't as, some areas of the country and the globe, let's face it, may not have all of the fabulous modeling tools and may not have an FIU at their disposal to be able to tap into you. So hopefully we'll be able to share, and I'm going to ask both Ka as well as you, Dr. Obey and Erin, if it would be okay to provide our participants with your contact information if they have additional questions that they would like to share with you. If that would
certainly, we work with the local
Fantastic.
governments, particularly local counties. And one example, we recently did a study using sea level rise projections to basically make recommendations how the building code needs to be changed, because I think nothing happens unless the standards are used. And I think that's a good example of the kind of science input that we can provide for decision making.
Thank you so much,
you.
Molly.
Yeah,
really,
thanks, Debbie, and thanks to everyone for this great discussion. I just, for the sake of time, want to thank everyone who joined us. I think we did want to leave it on a positive note, so maybe we can just go around with those who can still stay on the call and talk about just enter in the chat box if you have an adaptation success story. And Debbie, if you wanted to share your thoughts on that to close us up, that would be great.
Fantastic. While you all are thinking and typing in your adaptation success story, let me tell you something that happened at the City of North Miami. We have a lot of repetitive loss properties in the city, and they all seem to be clustered in the low income area and in what's called the historic Arch Creek Basin. Looking at us, we found a survey from 1840 that shows that most of that area was an old slough, very deep creeks, and that water continues to flood under our feet. So the city wanted to figure out, what can we do with these repetitive loss sites that aren't your typical, open field or whatever. So we participated with Van Allen Institute. It's a nonprofit foundation out of New York. They did an international competition, a design competition, and Dr. Obey and I were on the jury. The design was for what we call a Good Neighbor Stormwater Park. The Stormwater Park is designed to hold 165,000 gallons of water to manage stormwater for 20 surrounding properties. It also has, in addition to the stormwater management, it has replicated and restored 4 different native biomes that were here previously. It has an interactive art component to it that's an educational piece, including art that was created by a very famous South Florida artist here to show how the water levels change. We had our ribbon cutting on December 15th, and on December 23rd, we had the largest rainfall event recorded in the city. And 4.5 inches was dropped in less than an hour. The park not only absorbed what it was designed for, but because our drains for the street, the adjacent street was blocked, it also absorbed all of the water from the street. So millions of gallons of water would have been distributed throughout the neighborhood if that park had not been in place. So it's beautiful, it has native vegetation, and it's a true success story for adaptation practice.
Congratulations.
So did we get anybody's
Yeah.
Yes.
It doesn't look like
Very
anyone
exciting.
submitted
Very
any
exciting.
in the chat, but we can keep it in there if anyone has any final thoughts on that. And we had a request for for people to share the case study. So we'll follow up with recording with the presenters and facilitators' contact information, and you guys can contact them directly for more information. But thank you to all of you guys for joining us today, and for the immense deep discussion on this topic. And I also just want to circle back and say this all is brought to you by Global Adaptation Month. Thanks for those who have made a commitment already. And if you haven't, make sure to visit www.globaladaptationmonth.org to put your project on the map. You can also send send us a email if you have any final questions for today. And yeah, thank you all. Debbie, do you have any final thoughts to close us up?
Yes, I'd like to again thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their fabulous time that they've spent with us today. And remember that it's all about planning. And don't forget, it's not streets, it's not buildings. Those are just the things. It's the people that we have to remember that we serve and who will be impacted by what is happening as far as sea level rise. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it.
The living system,
Take
Debbie.
care.
Thank you.
It's a living system. That's right, Carl. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Molly. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
It's been very
Bye,
educational.
guys. Thank you again.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yes, take care, everybody.